All right, journalist Nurit Ben has covered the peace process, if you want to call it that, for a long time, and she's a very experienced journalist from Israel. Nurit, can you tell me, first of all, what do we call this deal? It is not a peace deal.
Right, I don't think you could call it a deal. It hasn't been able to be described as a deal for a long time. I mean, as you know, in the very beginning, President Donald Trump called it the deal of the century. Then exactly a year ago, when I was in Bahrain covering the first unveiling, the Peace for Prosperity, this economic first part, they switched the rhetoric, I think very intentionally, to call it the opportunity of the century. And at this point, I don't know what we can call it at all. It really is sort of an idea or a vision. But it's really at a point of irrelevance, I think, at this point. I mean, the Palestinians cut off all ties with the United States, with the White House about 2 years ago now, during the embassy move. They have no interest, in hearing about it and speaking about it. Much less sitting down at an actual table together. And in any other way, it hasn't really advanced. And then if annexation does move forward in any way, I think that will really put out the final embers.
So let's talk about it in terms of, let's give the White House, Jared Kushner and the president the benefit of the doubt for a minute, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and say, okay, they have a real proposal. And the proposal is what? We're going to annex up to 30% of Palestinian land, and they get what in return, and why would this ever work?
Well, why it would ever work, I don't want to speak for them. It would allow Israel, as you say, to extend sovereignty to about 30% of the West Bank, including all settlements in the Jordan Valley, and then there would be sort of the rest reserved for Palestinians for a set period, I believe about 4 years, in which they would be expected to meet a certain set of conditions, stopping incitement, stopping stipends to terrorists, giving citizens full civil rights, and so on and so forth. But honestly, nobody's going to get that far.
All right. Well, when I heard about it, after covering Oslo, where the Palestinians were offered Jerusalem as a homeland, they were offered a continuous piece of land in the West Bank. They were offered continuing negotiations on either right of return of millions now of Palestinians that were pushed out in 48 and 67, or some kind of compensation, and the latter being the more likely. What are they getting out of this? I really don't understand. Some kind of economic boost, or what are they trying to sell them?
Well, I think that was the way the Trump administration saw it. And again, I think the real economic part of it that I saw the most up close was, again, in Bahrain, where they were trying to unveil this economic part. And you had prominent ambassadors from Arab Gulf states. You had some Palestinians flying under the radar and so on. And the real mentality was, look, nothing has worked so far. You have a lot to gain economically, that economics needs to precede peace. That obviously the economic situation in the West Bank is bad and Gaza is disastrous. And their perspective was it was a sort of regional picture of, once again, that they could finally, because of the warming ties between Israel and the Gulf Arab states, because of the sort of impatience in the Gulf Arab states who say, behind the scenes, well, you know what, we don't have so much patience for a deal. We don't have patience for the Palestinians anymore. We want to take a step forward. We want to help them, but we also want to benefit from whatever cooperation we can get with Israel. And so I think that was part of their fundamental argument is, the train is leaving the station. You stand a lot to gain from it. So come sit down and talk. But as we see, nothing has so far come out of that.
I think the Palestinians are not going to be dragged in behind that train if they're unwilling to go. So can we just separate the president and American interests and Netanyahu for a minute? And from the American side, why would they support something that's kind of a non-starter? Is it because they can,
right.
Do you think that there's political theater there coming up to an election in the US, and they can say, we have a Middle East peace deal?
Well, I think that there's a few parts to that answer. First of all, I think that the reason this is being discussed in Washington now, and we've seen this week all these conversations behind the scenes with all the people involved, including U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is because Netanyahu has, since the reveal in January, made this an issue. He's been pushing it more and more. So it's sort of pushed the Trump administration to sit down and think, well, what do we agree to? What do we not agree to? That being said, there seems to be a split within the administration itself. From what I understand, there's Jared Kushner, senior advisor to the president, who has been a key part of this deal and has been really working the Gulf angle, quite a bit throughout, who sees annexation as part of this broader deal that was laid out, sees it as leverage that could be used to get eventually the Palestinians to make concessions, to come to the table, and so forth. And then there's Ambassador David Friedman, who's a big proponent of settlements and who seems to be pushing this far more aggressively. As far as President Trump himself, I mean, I, like you, and I think every other journalist, wouldn't presume to know what he's thinking or what his plans are. I don't really see what is in it for him, because other than distraction, as you mentioned, which of course is a valid point. Domestic distraction can always be valuable.
I think he needs some international boost, whether it be in the Baltics with the Serbs in Kosovo, which he's not going to get now, or maybe a Middle East peace deal. So maybe that would have helped him. And Jared, Kushner.
If we're talking about a deal, absolutely. I mean, he certainly wanted the victory of being the first president to actually achieve some real form of Middle East peace. Sure.
But I mean, they rolled it out. They rolled it out as a deal. I mean, there was the theater minus the Palestinians, which was a pretty big hole. But there was the theater of that news conference in Washington where they said, we have this is historic. I mean,
absolutely. All of that theater aside, what I'm speaking about, and I think you're talking about the deal, and I'm moving on to speak about even just annexation, because I think the political theater that they've managed to get out of the deal has maybe come to an end. I mean, we saw the reveal with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the same room with prominent Gulf Arab ambassadors, taking the stage, taking the podium directly after President Trump, almost as if it was his, space in Jerusalem. That was, as you say, sort of the ultimate political theater, and potentially a very good distraction for President Donald Trump in a way to put himself on the international stage. But when we get to this point, when the deal is no longer really a concrete discussion even, and annexation is, specifically from the discussions happening now in Washington, which are centered on annexation, what do we do about it? What do we say to Netanyahu? What do we greenlight? What do we not? For that, I mean, Trump, his evangelical base, which has been a key point in Israel, they're not too interested in annexation, not in the same way that they were in the embassy move. So,
all right, what about Netanyahu's base? Are they interested in annexation? Netanyahu is the right and has always been. He certainly needed this maybe before the election. You can talk about how much did he actually garner from that? But I mean, is this just playing to his base as well?
You mean you're asking about Netanyahu's intentions in particular?
Yes.
Well, I mean, look, Netanyahu overall, I know you followed, all of this and been a correspondent in Jerusalem. You've probably seen various iterations of it because he has been the prominent public figure in Israel for so long. He's promised sweeping annexation time and again in election cycles. It plays ideally to his base, the right wing, the further right wing, the settler movements. It never materializes. He's never fulfilled those sweeping annexation promises. This time, after January, when the peace plan was revealed, and Netanyahu sort of immediately took it as an opportunity to announce, hey, this is the green light, we have to do it. It does feel a little bit different. You could say Israel is in a perpetual election cycle, 3 in about a year. So, they're always looking towards the next, and it's currently in a very fragile government. So that is one piece. It's always there. And the other part might be legacy. Netanyahu, I think, is very much also looking towards his legacy within his own country, towards his own base. And this may be part of it for him.
I'm curious about the Israeli left, if I can just very quickly touch on that, because there was a real peace movement in the 90s when Yitzhak Rabin came out and announced Oslo I and Oslo II. And prior to the assassination, there was real hope. And, we witnessed the redeployment of troops out of Bethlehem and Jericho and Ramallah. And suddenly Palestinian kids weren't coming out and throwing stones at Israeli soldiers anymore. There was this real moment and this breath of, maybe these people can live beside each other, and this is going to work. And then spiraling down into violence of the bus bombs, and then another intifada, which became far more violent than anything we had ever seen before. Is the Israeli left still hanging in there, or are they so despondent and disappointed with the original process that they think you can never arm a Palestinian, if you want to call it a state, a two-state solution? It'll never work because they're fundamentally, philosophically against the state of Israel.
I think the Israeli left is definitely still hanging in there in terms of ideology. There's certainly a belief that Israel itself, that the Israeli people cannot have a solid future without a two-state solution, something that is less and less popular in general, that is less and less spoken of in general. I would say that it's the left itself that in the broader political map has shrunken so substantially, because as you point to, I mean, really after the second intifada, it served to just kill, all these ideas that in retrospect seem, ridiculous and naive. Here's the moderate, the left wing saying, look, we can have peace. Look, we've made these great strides and this is going to open up a different future. And the second intifada, and I mean, the daily suicide bombs, the sheer amount of fear and death there, really served in retrospect as what I think is the death blow.
And I think, you and I take for granted that a lot of people remember these things, but I mean, bus bombs on Dizengoff Street in Tel Aviv.
Every single day. I mean, there was not one day where people didn't wake up to that.
I mean, the violence was as terrible and inhuman as it gets, really, I think.
Yeah, I mean, true, and everywhere, in shopping malls in Tel Aviv, in clubs, across the country, no place was safe, and that was obviously a massive national collective trauma. I mean, I'm American. I was born and raised in the United States, so I had a family here, but I watched it from abroad. So I can't say I lived through it. I certainly saw the impact it had, culture-wise. And every morning you turn on the TV, there was a different bus bomb. I think over time also.
I covered it, and I can tell you as a correspondent, it was some of it was just, horrible. And these are not Israeli soldiers against Palestinian armed men. I mean, these are, grandfathers and grandmothers and kids in cafes. And I mean, it's, I think personally, I think it's just disgusting violence, and you can't justify it in any way. But I mean, getting back, but the Palestinians have suffered violence on their side. So when we come back to annexation, if it is forced through and Netanyahu tries to physically move on the ground in annexation, do you think that will, first of all, I want to ask you about the Palestinians, will that usher in a new period, do you think, of violence and a new intifada, perhaps, if you want to call it that? And how will Egypt and Jordan and the neighbors next to Israel react to that as well?
Well, so on the Palestinian side, in terms of violence, I think there's two sort of things to look at. There's the very initial, what's going to happen in the immediate aftermath. If, let's say, even a smaller version of annexation is approved by the Trump administration, because an important note, it will not go forward. The Israeli government will not go forward without a green light from the administration. And then there's the bigger, more long-term picture and context. In terms of the immediate violence, I mean, I've talked to, in the last few days, several different Palestinians, former ministers and officials. I honestly don't think anybody knows, even the Palestinians or Israeli security officials, exactly what to predict. I think it's safe to say it would be an immediate, very volatile period. Demonstrations for sure. The degree to which those demonstrations become violent, as you know, depends on so many different factors, because the way one thing starts in this region can snowball very quickly into something very different. Absolutely. And the smallest thing or misinterpretation or a death can obviously snowball into something totally different. I think an important thing to watch in terms of violence is Hamas, actually, because Hamas, for those who aren't familiar with this, with all the very complicated internal politics also within the Palestinians, a bitter rival of Fatah, of the Palestinian Authority that rules the West Bank. They have every reason.
The more moderate authority.
Absolutely.
Fatah versus.
Absolutely. And Hamas has every reason to try to take advantage of a situation like this. They have a presence in the West Bank in places like Hebron to sort of try to sow some chaos, try to push the Palestinian Authority even further into a corner. So that's a factor to watch. And then there's the backdrop as well, in terms of the tinderbox that you mentioned. And that's that the Palestinian Authority, I think it was in May, just about a month ago, moved to cut off all its agreements with Israel. And there are many. I mean, there are many active agreements between Israel and the West Bank that really help run the day-to-day in security and otherwise. And part of that is deciding to no longer accept the tax money that Israel collects on their behalf. So Israel passes on this tax money, and then the Palestinian Authority uses that money to pay its people salaries. So the moment they say, we're not even accepting the money from Israel, they can no longer pay salaries. And we've seen before, they've attempted it before, it wasn't really successful. It obviously causes an enormous amount of distress on the Palestinian public as well, because they need to get paid, they need to eat. And of course, we're talking about coming out of a global pandemic where, tourism is zero in Bethlehem and Ramallah and so on. So I think that only serves to show how much more it could be a tinderbox. But again, it's very difficult to predict.
All right. And very quickly, Egypt, Jordan.
Jordan, I think, is almost as important, if not more, to watch than the West Bank itself. I mean, we've seen they've already spoken out very strongly. The king said that they would withdraw ambassadors, that they would even consider scaling back the peace treaty. Jordan is certainly in a position to spearhead very strong international diplomacy against it, more so than the Palestinians, I think. It's a U.S. ally. And of course, Jordan also has about 2 million Palestinians living there. And so also violence within Jordan, on the streets of Jordan, also putting pressure on the Jordanian king is certainly something to watch. Egypt has been relatively silent so far, but I can't see that a step like this, even for those nations that don't have a peace treaty like Egypt with Israel, but who have been getting closer and closer to Israel, some of those Gulf nations, very hard for me to see them being able to, keep silent and not really pose a united front if something like this happens.
Well, that's some kind of deal they're talking about, this annexation.
Yeah.
I tell you. Nurit Ben, great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dana.